Pokémon. Everyone's favorite brand of Pokémon monsters has given rise to a cult following, a multiplicity of games, and a unique taste to the RPG formula. But how in the heck did this series get to this kind of following? How did Pokémon get from this to this? From Generation 1 dealing with Red and Blue, and to the latest generation dealing with X and Y. To discuss this topic with more variety, we will have to discuss the evolution of Pokémon. Now, before we get into all those crazy Pokemon memes out there, I brought in a fellow Pokemon enthusiast to talk about the series up until this point, Elijah Elfo.
Thanks for having me. Now, let's start with the very first Pokemon games on everyone's favorite Game Boy, Generation 1. Pokemon Red and Blue were released in 1996 in Japan by Game Freak, except that initially, in Japan, it was just red and green. Anyways, Pokemon is a third-person RPG. The player can use these special creatures known as Pokemon to battle other Pokemon. In doing so, the player can level up his or her own creatures to progress the game. Once certain Pokemon reach a particular level, they can evolve. Once it evolves, the said Pokemon will receive higher stats.
And that sounds very simple, right? Well, actually, this seemingly simple design actually encompasses a much grander formula. Each Pokemon has its own unique stats, to HP, special attack, speed, etc. Additionally, each Pokemon has its own type that has its own strengths and weaknesses. For example, a water type is effective against a fire type but weak against a grass type.
Pokemon is essentially a game featuring a more in-depth version of rock, paper, scissors, in which the player has to be mindful of each individual Pokemon's strengths and weaknesses. One of the objectives of the game is to catch wild Pokemon using these items called Pokeballs. In Generation 1, there were a total of 151 Pokemon, in which of those 151 Pokemon, my favorite was Venonat. In order to catch them all, the player must catch and trade Pokemon between versions.
And there are a lot of Pokemon out there. Two legendary Pokemon who are seemingly godlike creatures of destruction, and shiny rare variants of Pokemon that sport a different color. Each Pokemon journey in essence is its own adventure. So that begs the question, why is it that the Pokemon series has a tendency for dual releases?
One of the reasons that Pokemon games are delivered in dual releases is to emphasize Pokemon as a community-based game, in which players can battle and trade Pokemon. Each version is essentially identical, but has Pokemon exclusive to that particular version. This allows players to see Pokemon not only as a single-player adventure, but something akin to an economic system, especially with trading Pokemon.
And despite what others might think, Pokemon can actually be compared to formulas used in stock exchange if you could believe it. For example, take EVs and IVs. No, not that kind of EV. EVs are effort values, which are stats that affect a Pokemon's developing strength. Targeting specific effort values can cause a certain Pokemon's stats to rise, well, incredibly. IVs, on the other hand, are individual values that determine a Pokemon's maximum potential. In other words, IVs are a Pokemon's talent, while EVs is the amount of specific training. And taking advantage of both values, along with the many variables including base stats, types, abilities, and moves, makes this seemingly kiddie game turn into something akin to military strategy.
This is what makes Pokemon as a series so special. The game is casual enough to draw in newcomers, but underneath its casual facade lies an in-depth formula that RPG fanatics can truly enjoy. Moving on to Generation 1, the setting is located in the Kanto region. Each Pokemon generation features its own region that is inhabited with its own unique species of Pokemon. Essentially, in pretty much all the Pokemon games, the main goal is to have the player explore the region and challenge every Pokemon gym.
And if the player really wants to be the very best like no one ever was, each gym typically specializes in a particular type of Pokemon. The player must figure out the best way to challenge each gym by taking advantage of a Pokemon's strengths and weaknesses. For example, let's say the first gym specializes in Rock-type Pokemon. It would be a smart thing to do to bring along a Water type for the ride, being that Water types are effective against Rock types.
After battling all of the gyms in the region, the player challenges the Pokemon League. There, the player faces off against the Elite Four, in which they specialize in their own typing as well. Once the player defeats them, you can then challenge the Pokemon champion. Successfully defeating the champion results in the player becoming the next champion and being in the coveted Hall of Fame.
This whole ordeal of challenging gyms and facing off against a champion is essentially used in all mainline Pokemon games. Later in 1998, Pokemon Yellow was released. The game is essentially an enhanced version of Red and Blue, but one neat thing is that you can't have Pikachu to follow you around.
Now let's move on to Generation 2. Pokémon Gold and Silver were released in 1999 in the region of Johto. This game introduced a day and night system in addition with introducing 100 new species of Pokémon, along with introducing 2 new Pokémon types, the Steel and Dark type. A major mechanic that Gold and Silver introduced was the breeding option. The player could drop off 2 Pokémon of the opposite sexes to a daycare. If done so, a Pokémon egg may be produced. The egg would hatch into a young Pokémon, and that Pokémon would inherit the species of the mother along with the stats of both.
Now, in addition with tampering with the Pokemon's EVs, trainers can effectively breed a Pokemon with desirable IVs, and then EV train them, which effectively makes Pokemon much more sophisticated in its algorithmic design. A later enhanced version of Gold and Silver known as Pokemon Crystal was released in 2000. The game is largely identical to Gold and Silver except that it did introduce the Battle Tower. Crystal is also my personal favorite in the series. Maybe it is just a nostalgia talking, but this game really does set me at ease. Now, my personal favorite Pokemon of Gen 2 is Skarmory. I don't know why, the design really does speak to me though.
Now, let's move on to the Game Boy Advance. In Generation 3, we had Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, which takes place in the region of Hoenn. This generation introduced a lot of new mechanics. For one, double battles were introduced where teams of Pokemon can face off against each other. This game also introduced Pokemon innate abilities and natures. Pokemon abilities can be used to enhance performance in battle. For example, a Bulbasaur uses its Overgrow ability to power up its grass type attacks. Pokemon natures, on the other hand, can influence the stat progression of Pokemon.
For example, let's say my Skarmory has an adamant nature. With this nature, my Skarmory will have an increased attack and a decreased special attack stat. Adding this mechanic to the grander Pokemon formula really makes the series much more elegant. Again, while this series appeals to newcomers with its casual facade, it has its own science of strategy that pleases hardcore players.
Additionally, Generation 3 introduced 135 new Pokemon, in which my favorite would be Combuskin. The generation also introduced Pokemon Contests, where Pokemon can compete against each other through performance.
An enhanced version known as Pokemon Emerald was later released in 2004. Like the third version of many of the Pokemon games, it is an updated title of the generation. An interesting note is that Emerald did introduce the Battle Frontier.
Also in this generation, remakes were released. Pokemon Fire Red and Pokemon Leaf Green. These games were essentially remakes of the first games, but they featured updated mechanics that the other games trailblazed.
I also enjoyed Fire Red and Leaf Green as they did their job pretty well, which is updating the games with new mechanics and seamless RPG fun. Would also recommend picking this up. Now let's head on to the Nintendo DS. Generation 4 Diamond and Pearl, which takes place in the Sinnoh region. Not only has the series received a graphical overhaul, but it introduced some new things to battle mechanics. There are 3 categories of moves: special, physical, and status. In a nutshell, special moves does not involve direct contact between battling Pokemon, while physical moves do, and status moves causes status changes with targeted Pokemon, for example burning or paralyzing. Before Generation 4, entire Pokemon types were deemed either physical or special, rather than classifying Pokemon moves that way. Furthermore, Generation 4 split Pokemon moves as either physical, special, or status, instead of classifying entire Pokemon types that way.
This further expanded the battle mechanics of Pokemon by giving players more options to work with, especially in competitive play. Moving on, 107 new Pokemon were introduced in this generation. The game also featured an underground minigame that supports Wi-Fi connectivity. Diamond and Pearl also made use of Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, allowing players to trade Pokemon throughout the world, making Diamond and Pearl the first mainline Pokemon games to have internet support.
Later in 2008, an enhanced version of Diamond and Pearl was released known as Pokemon Platinum. This game features a new plot, along with featuring the Battle Frontier that was first introduced in Pokemon Emerald. Platinum is certainly an interesting iteration of the series. I did enjoy the distortion world for what it is worth, and that is why the origin form of Giratina happens to be my favorite Pokemon of that generation, mainly because, well, I just like the design.
Then, another batch of remakes were released in 2009, Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. These games are enhanced remakes of Pokemon Gold and Silver. An interesting note about these games is that they do echo a certain mechanic found in Pokemon Yellow, in which the first Pokemon in the player's party can follow them around.
For some reason, I found Heart Gold and Soul Silver to be really addicting iterations of the series. To me, this remake blends old and new in harmonious fashion. A great pastime if you ever get the chance to pick it up. Now let's head on to Generation 5, Pokemon Black and White dealing in the region of Unova. This game added a grand total of 156 new Pokemon, along with featuring updated graphics and sprites. Black and White features a seasonal cycle, in which seasons change, and Pokemon can also see change in their appearance as a result.
The game also introduced triple battles, and rotation battles. Additionally, Black and White also introduces hidden abilities where Pokemon can gain another ability. Pokemon with a hidden ability can be obtained by capturing certain event Pokemon, finding them through certain locations, or by Wi-Fi. Furthermore, Generation 5 did expand Wi-Fi connectivity, the result of which is Pokemon Global Link. In Black and White, this allowed players to obtain access to the Pokemon Dream World, where they could catch Pokemon that were not normally obtainable in Unova. Out of the 156 Pokemon in Generation 5, I like Caracosta.
Later in 2012, Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 were released. The game is essentially an enhanced remake of the prior games, but plot-wise it is a sequel. In hindsight, visually the game is appealing as a title for the DS, but largely I felt that Gen 5 is currently the least innovative generation in the series. I had fun playing the game, don't get me wrong, but I felt that particular generation did not offer too many new things. But hey, at least we get Ice Cream Pokemon.
And finally, in 2013, Generation 6 came into existence with the Nintendo 3DS. Enter Pokémon X and Y. These games are the first to present the main Pokemon series in 3D. Additionally, these games allowed the player to customize their trainer's appearance. The generation introduced the new Fairy-type Pokemon and introduced the new Mega Evolution mechanic.
In Mega Evolution, certain fully evolved Pokemon can temporarily evolve in battle by holding an appropriate Megastone in conjunction with a trainer holding a Keystone, taking place in the Kalos region. X and Y really fleshed out the online component of Pokemon through the player search system. Players can really get into the competitive drive of Pokemon through battling other players online.
Also, X and Y introduced Wonder Trade that allows players to trade Pokemon without even knowing what the player is going to get. These games also introduced Sky Battles where only certain flying types and some Pokemon with the ability Levitate can participate in. Plus, you can also interact with Pokemon through Pokemon Ami. Additionally, this game also features Horde encounters where one of the player's Pokemon face off against 5 opponents at once.
Also, remember the EV training we explained earlier on in this video? Well, getting your Pokemon EV trained does involve a long and tedious process, but that was before Gen 6. In Pokemon X and Y, Super Training is introduced, which effectively cuts down this previously tedious process. This in turn makes the game much more accessible to newcomers of the series. And speaking about Gen 6, my favorite Pokemon of the generation is Greninja, and boy, he needs to be nerfed. In all honesty, the main reason why he's my favorite of the generation is because of all the memes.
And finally, we are at Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which released in 2014. The game is an enhanced remake to Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. Now, isn't it a bit awe-inspiring how this game series transformed from this to this? Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is a clear example of where the Pokemon series has evolved into.
The series has certainly gone through substantial change. To Gen 1's original template, to Gen 2's genders and breeding, Gen 3's double battles, abilities, and natures, Gen 4's physical special move split, Gen 5's hidden abilities, rotation, and triple battles, and Gen 6's Mega Evolution and Wi-Fi expansion. The current generation of Pokemon has steadily evolved to this point, to capturing Pokemon, battling other trainers, and maybe find some secrets along the way. Pokemon, everyone's favorite brand of Pokémonsters, has given rise to a cult following, a multiplicity of games, and a unique taste to the RPG formula. But how did this series get to this kind of following? Pokemon as a series evolved from a simple RPG revolving around Pokémonsters to a gaming juggernaut. It is amazing to say the least how Pokemon evolved from being on the original Game Boy to being a full 3D experience on the Nintendo 3DS. And this is what we discovered while making this video, that the evolution of Pokemon is more of a collection of progression. Pokemon is a series with a simple yet elegant design, but beneath its casual facade lies a deep algorithm for hardcore RPG players, and it is this dual accommodation of both newcomers and hardcore players that leaps each iteration of Pokemon to greater heights. But where will Pokemon as a series go next? Well, I am not sure, but seeing the current progression of Pokemon, I just can't help but wonder where Pokemon will evolve into next. What is your favorite Pokemon?
Considering all of the game generations that have come out over the years, my favorite Pokemon is still first gen Venonat. I've used this Pokemon on my team for several years, and it's really an underrated Pokemon.
Well, considering all generations, my personal favorite Pokemon is Dusknoir. I just really admire the design. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, everyone, and special thanks goes to Elijah Elfo for joining me here.
Thanks, it was really great to be here. For the next evolution video, we are going to give you the decision. Comment below to tell us which one you want to see next.
Do you want to see the evolution of Mario or the evolution of Super Smash Bros? Comment below to tell us which one you would like to see. Anyways, I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you're new. Till then, have a great rest of the day, and I hope you all the best. Take care.
Hey, I hoped you enjoyed this. Click the link to see the evolution of Metroid. Till then, enjoy this running Pikachu.